Russian propaganda would have us believe that the war in Ukraine is just an extended civil war, driven by a popular insurgency. But this seems to be very far from the truth, a gross distortion of reality. Ukraine is fighting for its very existence against an enemy that has repeatedly claimed that it is not a real country, but a tool of Western foreign policy wielded by countries that are inherently Russo-phobic. But is the reality much simpler? Could this in fact be the least morally ambiguous war since World War II, a clear-cut case of autocracy versus democracy? Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe so other people can discover the wonderful guests that we have on the channel. Henry Marsh is an English neurosurgeon and a pioneer of neurosurgical advances and has a strong professional connection to Ukraine. He worked with neurosurgeons in the former Soviet Union, mainly in Ukraine, with his protégé neurosurgeon Igor Kurilets from 1992. His work there was the subject of the BBC Storyville film, The English Surgeon, made in 2007. His widely acclaimed memoir, Do No Harm, Stories of Life, Death and Brain Surgery, was published in 2014. According to The Economist, this memoir is so elegantly written that it is little wonder some say that Mr Marsh, neurosurgery has found its Boswell. His second memoir, Admissions, A Life in Brain Surgery, was published in 2017, and his most recent book was published in 2022 to critical acclaim and explores his bewildering transition from doctor to patient. Henry, I'm so pleased to welcome you to the channel.
My pleasure.
Well, let's start, because I've heard you in numerous interviews state this, and I'd love to start at this point, about the moral or lack of moral ambiguity of this conflict. Is it as simple as an autocracy trying to crush a democracy?
Well, my route to medicine was unusual. I originally read PPE. I studied Soviet politics under Archie Bryant's and Antony's. So I've been trained to always see two sides of the argument. But for me, both rationally and emotionally, this is a completely moral war. I can't think of any similarly justified war since the Second World War. For me, this is the threat. Why the war is taking place, because the spread of democracy in Ukraine is a very real threat to Putin's autocratic, kleptocratic system, which of course has very, very deep roots in Russian culture, going back to Genghis Khan and beyond. And that's what it's really about.
And is that the real threat? Yeah. Is
that's why I found Ukraine so fascinating when I first went there in 1992, since it was clear this was a borderland between Western relative freedom and Eastern lack of freedom. And that was clear to me right from the start.
And do you get that impression that this struggle is not a new one? Obviously, it's had a resurgence since 1991 and independence, but is this struggle for the Ukrainian territory to break away from its, let's say, dominant neighbor? What's your sense of how deep that struggle goes?
Well, it goes very deep. First of all, of course, Western Ukraine was never part of Russia. It was part of Poland and Austria-Hungary. Most of my, but not all, most of my Ukrainian colleagues and friends are all Western Ukrainians. And most of them have always hated the Russians. And most of them have stories of grandparents who were either killed or sent to Siberia. So it is complicated, but there is a long history of Russia suppressing Ukrainian culture. You know, Stalin suppressed the Ukrainian language, and the Tsars are doing the same in the 19th century. So there's been a long, long struggle going on. And of course, one of the things that's so fascinating about Eastern Europe is the history is so complicated. You know, there are no straightforward divisions. But personally, I have absolutely no doubt that what Russia is trying to do in Ukraine is despotic and frankly quite thoroughly evil.
And this really undermines one of the key propaganda myths, doesn't it? That this is in somehow a civil war that Russia has got involved in, that it's a people fighting themselves, and this bogus narrative of it being an organic insurgency in the East. I don't believe that's true, and I'm interested to hear your point of view.
Well, I haven't been, I went to Crimea once, which of course is a sort of Costa Geriatrica for the Red Army and the KGB. It was on Moscow time. This was years ago. But I haven't been to Donbass or Luhansk. But I've spent the last 30 years talking to Ukrainian friends, and obviously they might be a bit biased. But the idea, obviously, I think the Rada made a big mistake trying to I don't quite know what, trying to remove the status of the Russian language in the East. But as far as I could tell, that was the worst of it. That is not exactly genocide, and it was a clumsy mistake. And the Ukrainians have made mistakes without a doubt. The irony is that Putin has done more than anybody else in the history of Eastern Europe to turn Ukraine into a coherent nation state. I was just talking this morning to one of my colleagues who was seeking my advice about a young woman from Odessa with a huge and benign brain tumor. And he was saying, she said that there's been a huge change of sentiment in Odessa in the last few months about the Russians, because Odessa traditionally was sort of Russophile on the whole. And it's anecdotal. This one patient says there's been a big change, which is not exactly surprising in view of what the Russians are doing.
Well, since this began, I've met a lot of refugees from the East. I've done a lot of interviews with people who tend to be more from, the central area and the eastern areas, because that's where, as you say, a lot of the sort of cultural and literary elite live in Kiev and so on, or they move from the East to go to Kiev because that's the big city and where a lot of the institutions are. But even amongst those in the East whose primary language has been Russian, there does seem to be an increased desire to develop Ukrainian, and understanding that Ukrainian is going to probably have a higher status as a language moving forward, even if it's not, enshrined necessarily in law. Everyone's going to have to potentially treat it as a primary language, just through the sheer, how could you call it? At the moment, I think people are feeling allergic to Russian, even if it's their native language.
Yeah, exactly.
And that leads me to one of the questions. I think this is quite a difficult one, because clearly you've studied, economics, politics, and you have that strategic lens when you look at this struggle. Does that conflict at all with your sort of training and empathy as a healer? Do you have a sense that you want the conflict to end as soon as possible? But that's understanding.
I was walking around Oxford this afternoon with my wife. It's a little bit cold and damp in Oxford, but nothing like Ukraine at the moment. And I was talking about the way it is getting colder in Ukraine now. Although what with climate change, you never quite know what's going to happen, because climate change is here. And it will hopefully, thousands of Russian soldiers will freeze to death. And my wife sort of criticized me for this sentiment. And then we had an interesting discussion about what it's like to be a Russian conscript. And if you surrender to the Ukrainians, you probably will never be able to go back to Russia. So people are being put in an impossible position, just as many Ukrainians were put in an impossible position by the Germans when the Germans took over Ukraine. And one shouldn't rush to judgment. It's obviously a tragedy for soldiers on both sides. But we know it's not just Putin, and that's the trouble. A lot of Russians are buying into the lie that this is a justifiable defensive operation, which we know, of course, it isn't.
And of course, hundreds of thousands fled the country, not as a protest against war, but as a simple impulse to save their lives and, still experience life and their families. And that's kind of understandable, that impulse. But many, many tens of thousands have been conscripted. And of course, as you say, some of those will be voluntary. It's almost impossible to know how many.
Yes, some will be. Yes. Yeah. And it became, because the Russian propaganda machine is so complete, it's very difficult as for me as sitting in England to get a handle on what really is happening. But I see no reason to think that. Well, I mean, there's no nice, cuddly liberal opposition waiting to take over in Russia. The most likely people to take over from Putin are even worse than he is, Prigozhin and Patrushev and people like that.
And that's an interesting comparison, isn't it? Because if we look at the way Ukraine and Russia have evolved over the last 30 years, since you've been sort of traveling to that part of the world, they have diverged in their development significantly.
They've diverged enormously. I was curious, in the mid-90s, I was working with some of the big neurosurgeons in Moscow. In fact, the deputy head of all of neurosurgery was a patient of mine. He came to London for me to operate on him. And I made several visits to Moscow. And I found actually the Russians very difficult to deal with, in the sense they were prickly, defensive, arrogant, and a bit sort of full of themselves. Whereas the Ukrainians, on the whole, who are historically been underdogs for ages, I found on the whole are much more ready to deal with somebody like myself without sort of feeling threatened by it. But again, it's complicated because I fell out with my main collaborator, Kurilets, eventually, because as he became more and more successful, he became more and more dictatorial, and like the very dictatorial Soviet-style professors, I thought I was helping him rebel against with the Western medical message of evidence and argument and treating patients better when they get treated, certainly in Russia and Ukraine half the time. So it's very sad at the end. I now work with younger people who I find more sympathetic and also better at working together and aren't in the Soviet hierarchical mode of, civility to people above you and shitting on people below you.
And do you think that's a generational problem? Or
yes, I think so, because Kurilets was totally a product of the Soviet time. The people my close friends now are all sort of 20 years younger. They're in their 50s or 40s, and so they were teenagers when the Soviet Union came to an end.
That arrogance that you talk about there is interesting, though, because I think the antithesis of that is that a certain disdain, as you say, for people beneath you, but also probably disdain for people generally. That, to my mind, is the hallmark of the Soviet system. And we can see Russians generally, my personal experience is a lot of Russians treat each other pretty poorly outside of their family circles. Does that also translate into an unfair distribution of, say, resources within a health system?
Well, I mean, Ukraine was even more oligarchic than Russia. I think about 10 or 12 people owned half the economy. The Akhmedovs and Kolomoyev and people like that. I haven't got the name right. But one of the big challenges Ukraine faces is reconstruction and restructuring the economy and getting away from the endemic corruption. But that is very difficult because corruption is totally endemic in the country, has been all the time I was there, and it's really difficult to eradicate because the other side of the coin of corruption is strong networks, people helping each other. I was always very impressed when I've been in Ukraine, how good people are helping each other if they're friends or their family, because the states, it's very hard for us in the West, I think, to understand what it's like to live in a country where essentially the state is your enemy. In the way they, particularly at the moment in England, have nothing but a lot of contempt for our politicians. But you don't actually feel they're positively trying to get you and crush you, which of course in the Soviet states was the case. And although Ukraine has very much got away from that, there is still a pretty hierarchical, dictatorial, corrupt tendency. At the moment, though, with the awfulness of all of the strikes on the energy infrastructure, and I talk to several friends virtually every day on the phone, they are incredibly tough. And a quarter of the population of Ukraine died during the war, or from the civil war, or the Holodomor. And they are very, very tough indeed. They will cope. I don't think for a moment that bombing Ukraine is going to achieve anything other than a lot of suffering. But then history tells us the Blitz in Britain, bombing the German cities, North Vietnam. When does bombing achieve anything? It doesn't.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, you can criticize it from the humane point of view, but also strategically, it is wasting their resources to no end.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And what's the impact of the blackout? Because, of course, I've talked to quite a few people I've interviewed.
Well, the hospitals, the civilian hospitals, my neurosurgery is not really a wartime specialty, although 25% of deaths in battle are from head injuries. You can't do much about it. So neurosurgery in the battlefield is mainly just repairing fairly minor superficial injuries to the skull or maybe the surface of the brain. So my contacts are mainly with colleagues who work in civilian hospitals, and they say, well, the hospitals are all of generators. So they act rather like, community centers. People come to the hospital to charge up their phones and memory banks and have a warm cup of tea and then go back to their freezing, unheated, lacking water apartment blocks. Although at the moment, I don't know about this afternoon, but I'm certainly quite a lot of power has been restored to Kiev.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen these extraordinary images of hospitals still running and operations being done under torchlight. Yes. I mean, how stressful and challenging must that be?
Well, it must be terribly difficult. But then, of course, as surgeons, we are used to stress. Stress is our business. I think it's not so much the operating. They have generators, so the chances of actually, and they have to decide. If when we start an operation, if there's a blackout, what do we do? The answer is we have to carry on. The problem is of anesthetic machines and ventilators and intensive care units, which need power, and then you just have to hand ventilate people, which gets very difficult. But my impression is that most of the hospitals are functioning reasonably well because they have standby generators.
And I guess those near the front line, they will have their own facilities. They will be
well. They will. And there, I don't know. I mean, of course, what they lack compared to British and American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan is helicopters to get people. Once you've stabilized a critically injured soldier, you need to get him back to a proper hospital as quickly as possible. And in Ukraine, that means going along in a truck, bumping up and down. And a lot of soldiers will die avoidably because of lack of rapid transfer once you initially stabilize them in a field station.
And that does seem to be a feature of Ukrainian character. You have stoicism, you have this extraordinary willingness to sort of carry on in the face of terrible, bestial behavior, but a concentration on the individual life, the importance of the individual life. That does seem to be in stark contrast to the way the Russians are treating their soldiers, both living, injured, and
it's extraordinary. But then, of course, the Ukrainian soldiers are fighting for their country, how could you have stronger morale than that? Whereas what are the Russian soldiers fighting for? Most of them must know it's extremely dubious. NATO isn't really NATO, it's a defensive organization, as they believe some endless propaganda they get. But it's grotesque. But equally large numbers of soldiers are being killed on both sides, probably. The Ukrainians are fairly discreet about it. But I was in Lviv a few weeks ago, and I went into the so-called St. Church. And also in July, when they got photographs of all the dead soldiers from Lviv, and there was hundreds of photographs. Now there are almost thousands. And every day when you're in the central square, you will see a funeral cortege and a trumpet is blown, and that's just in Lviv. So the carnage is terrible, let alone all the post-traumatic stress soldiers will have, civilians will have, children will have. I mean, the the psychological damage from all this. And you think about this, think of the Battle of the Boyne in Northern Ireland, which is what, 400 or 500 years ago? I mean, if we're still around, the human race is still around in 400 or 500 years' time, in Ukraine, they'll still hate the Russians. This is never going to go away. It's extraordinary.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, you know, last week was the anniversary of the Holodomor, and
yes.
Awareness of that in the West is relatively low, but awareness is really increasing in Ukraine.
Yes.
I mean, people passed traditionally stories around from family to family in a quite discreet way. Now it's becoming more institutionalized to remember that history. But the Soviet Union did a really good job, didn't it, on trying to repress these stories and muddy the waters.
Exactly. And of course, some of it is difficult. I mean, Yushchenko created a big Holodomor memorial in the center of Kiev, and Stefan Bandera became a sort of hero. But I mean, you know, nobody is a very clean pair of hands in that part of the world. And I can't, I've read various books about Bandera and you know, the 1940s in Ukraine and the Carpathians. There was an awful lot of horrible ethnic cleansing going on. But I think you have to accept that, you know, in a sense that's irrelevant now to what is going on. And the way the Russians are claiming that, you know, the Jewish Zelensky was a Nazi. I mean, it was just grotesque and obscene, really.
And the first missile attack, I think, in the war, or one of the first, was on Babin Yar, which is the
That's
Holocaust
right, yeah.
memorial.
Well, it missed. They're aiming for the television mast, which is just next to Babin Yar, and they hit Babin Yar instead, which seemed rather appropriate.
And you mentioned the trauma, not just the physical trauma, of course, which will be dealt with in the aftermath of the war, but that psychological trauma, the hidden cost of freedom.
Well, that firstly is for soldiers. And although we know that post-traumatic stress is less of a problem in soldiers who are well-led and well-motivated, which obviously the Ukrainians are, nevertheless, you're seeing young men who will have seen and done terrible things. You know, soldiers aren't nice to each other during a war. It's not very civilized. And you have to live with that for the rest of your life. And that's one of the causes of post-traumatic stress is civilians having to do unspeakable things and finding it hard to cope with. But I'm not so concerned about all the children. All the children, I don't know. Obviously, I think the Ukrainian media are exaggerating a bit about the numbers abducted to Russia. But it does seem there have been sort of forced abductions of Ukrainian children to Russia, which again is you know, that's again, you go back to the Nazis who were finding Aryan children in Ukraine and then kidnapping them and having them adopted in Germany. It's very hard. I find it very hard to find parallels with what Russia is doing, other than with the Nazis in the Second World War. And the fact the Russians are claiming the Ukrainian government is a sort of fascist Nazi government. I mean, everything is turned absolutely upside down. And there's always a grain of truth. Yes, you know, the original Azov battalion after 2014 did have some pretty unsavory types. If you've seen Philip Sands' film, My Nazi Legacy, where he meets some of these. But that's not the case then. I mean, later on, the regiment was taken into the army, became a regular regiment. Anyway, we know with the general election, fewer than 5% of people voted for the extreme right-wing party. It is not an issue.
That's it. And there isn't a military in the world, whether it be the US or even the British, where there aren't elements of extreme right sentiment.
Exactly. So
Ukraine is
and also atrocities. I mean, atrocities get committed. I'm not saying you should do nothing about it, but you have to accept this happens in war. The question is how much you try to stop it. And it's quite clear the Russians weren't trying to stop it at all. When you look at Bucha and Irpin.
I think there's a crucial difference there, and it's quite an interesting one to explore. I mean, there clearly will have been atrocities on the Ukrainian side. Yes. There's that case last week of the soldiers apparently shot when one of them refused to surrender. But these seem to be relatively isolated from what we know, whereas the Russian atrocities aren't incidental. They seem to be part of a conscious strategy by the officer class as well.
Yes. Well, just like trying to take out all the electricity supply in Ukraine. I mean, it's directly targeting civilians. And I mean, we know it's sort of, I can't remember his name, the guy who was in Syria is now in charge of the Russian army in Ukraine. And they deliberately bombed hospitals. Because if you kill a doctor, you kill all the patients that doctor might have saved, I mean, completely amoral, completely ruthless.
And you see that in what they're doing to the cities as well,
Mariupol. I hadn't been to Mariupol, but by all accounts, very nice, Western-style city, doing very well. It's been completely razed. Again, you have to look at Aleppo and places like that to find anything comparable.
And to what end is interesting, because Russia's losses of personnel and equipment are absolutely eye-watering, and yet
they've got the long-term impact of sanctions as well, which by all accounts is having some effect on the Russian economy. No, I mean, it's become a huge act of self-harm, really. But of course, they've now, Putin and the army, been boxed into a corner. They're losing the ground war. They haven't got air supremacy. So they're kind of stuck, and they won't use nuclear weapons because they'll lose whatever support they have from China and India and Africa. So, of course, they threaten nuclear weapons. But if you think about it, if you start giving in to nuclear blackmail, it's the beginning of the end. Then the next time, we're going to use our nuclear bombs. You have to stand up to it.
It's a series of dominoes,
I'm very reassured to see the way. Well, certainly in England, I've heard virtually no voices, people saying that the Ukrainians ought to compromise and negotiate. My own view is they ought to give up Crimea, because it's sort of part of Ukraine as a historical oddity. Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine. I was at 56, I think. Historically, it's a mess. It was Tatar. Stalin kicked all the Tatars out. They were starting to come back when I was there 20 years ago. But they were complete sort of, third world citizens. And the place has been largely taken over by Russians. But my Ukrainian friends get, Crimea, Crimea's around my heart. They get worked up about it. But I'd have thought abandoning Crimea, they can go to Turkey or Greece for their summer holidays. But they get very cross with me when I say this. So I've learned not to say it now.
I think as well strategically, it's having spoken to a few generals, I think logistically it's an incredibly tough challenge to retake Crimea because of the logistics required.
Well, I follow a few military people on Twitter. There's an American guy called Hertling, who on the whole has been pretty spot on all along. And he says the situation now is very difficult. Not just because of winter, but just it's going to be very hard for either side to do much. So I fear it has all the makings of the frozen war now on an even bigger scale, where it was just after the separatists and Donbass and Luhansk.
I did have hopes that there would be much more movement, especially after Kherson was taken. But we're seeing images coming out of Bakhmut, which really resemble the First World War.
It's trench war. It's
trench warfare, exactly. With the blasted trees and the muddy trenches.
I saw the same photographs. And the Dnipro is a huge barrier, So I don't know what will happen next. I don't think anybody knows really. But I'd be surprised, and I'm no military expert, if there's any great big sudden breakthrough as there was in Kharkiv whenever it was in July and August.
I wouldn't put it past Putin pulling some stunts, whether it be trying to involve Belarus more significantly. So there could be some interesting movement.
My friends in Lviv talk about that, because it's not very far from the Belarusian border. But on the other hand, Lukashenko's position is obviously pretty fragile, and one doesn't know whether his army would actually agree.
Well, they have even less incentive, don't they, to participate?
Even less. Yeah.
So when it comes to Reconstruction, the people you're speaking to, I mean, there are plans in the wings, assuming Ukrainian victory sometime next year, whether it be spring, summer, or autumn.
Yes.
Opinions diverge, but some kind of modern-day Marshall Plan seems to be having an effect behind the scenes. How strategic do you think that planning is?
Well, and there are two problems. First of all, Russia's not going away, and Putin, or his successor's not going away. So I suppose if Ukraine joins NATO, I suppose that would act as some kind of disincentive, because it would trigger off the Third World War III by then invading Ukraine. But that's still obviously a very big step to take. But how you can guarantee a peaceful solution when we know Putin and co. does lie and will break any agreement without any hesitation at all. Very difficult to do business with people like that who only respect power and strength. So that's the first problem, how you could make the peace sustainable. And the second problem, as I said, is this deep-rooted corruption. And how, if you're going to put a lot of money into Ukraine, how do you make sure how it doesn't all fall off the back of a lorry, which is what happened to most of it in Afghanistan and Iraq. So you need a lot of governance, and I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure the people in power are well aware of that problem, but and I can tell you a story that one of the recent ministers of health, an American Ukrainian, changed the examination system in medical schools. And the examination papers were written in Ukrainian in America, taken to Ukraine, and then taken back to America to be marked. And this made her immensely popular. The students now had to actually work, and the teachers lost a large source of income with the bribes. Because it was the amazing fact in Ukraine, you'd have doctors who basically had just bribed their way for a qualification. And was it you saying about Nigerian doctors in Odessa? Somebody was, anyway, another person I was talking to had been in Odessa in the Soviet time, and they had quite a lot of Nigerian medical students who became doctors and were going to go back to work in Nigeria. And apparently all the locals in Odessa wanted to be treated by them because they knew they were proper doctors. They actually had done the exams and were going to have to work as proper doctors. I mean, it's just extraordinary.
I mean, that's common to Russia, isn't it? And that's the other irony of Russia putting labels like, Ukraine's a corrupt society as if it undermines its right to exist. But Russia equally, I mean, when I was there, the same stories, most exams were oral. And there, it was a well-organized system of bribing. You knew which tutors were bribable and which ones weren't, what they'd expect, whether the bribe was in kind or in money. And it was exactly the same kind of system.
And when that goes in through all levels of society, it's very, very hard to change that. So we just have to hope that the war will somehow cauterize that and give, by analogy, an optimistic analogy with the end of the Second World War, when all the soldiers fighting in the British Army came back to England and didn't want more of the same. Yes, Churchill, they all loved Churchill, he won the war, but they did not want this old right-wing imperialist. Then hence the welfare state was born. So whether the Ukrainian army will have a similar effect when they finally, God willing, come home, it'd be nice to think that might be the case.
And that, of course, applies to healthcare as well, doesn't it? Because in the 1920s and 30s, the provision of professional healthcare was extremely patchy and very much would depend on status, resources, and so on.
Yes.
We know that in Russia, that your access to healthcare now very largely depends, again, on status, bribes, and money.
Yes, what it did in the Soviet time. I mean, and certainly, and it's still the case in Ukraine. If you go to a state hospital, you have to pay. So, but there are now some very good private hospitals. I mean, it's very complicated. It's a problem I wrestle with, because although I did private practice when I was still in practice, I've always had deep reservations about it as a way of running a system, because it generates the whole problems you have in America with a madly commercial system and a huge overtreatment. But now watching the NHS, they're literally falling apart. The government's very happy if everybody who can afford it goes privately. but it's and in Ukraine, you know, the private, there's one or two new private hospitals in Kiev, which are as good as anything in the West. It's fantastic. And everybody accepts they have to pay. The problem is, of course, people at the bottom of society get virtually no treatment at all.
That's it. So if you're in the wrong area of the country, if you're in the wrong class, then you're not going to get anything like
You're
that.
going back sort of 70 or 80 years historically as to what you'll get. Yeah. And that's very sad to see. And I found that very difficult in the years when I was working there, which is why, I mean, I thought, well, the main person I work with now, I know very well indeed. And he also speaks extremely good English. And I've seen him with patients, and he's very nice, and he's clearly not financially motivated. I mean, only after 30 years he actually got an ordinary apartment. He was living in a one-room Soviet apartment with his wife and daughter for years and years, and just had no interest in making money. So that's the problem. The sort of work I've been doing in other countries, not just Ukraine, is finding people who are honest and whom you can trust and whom you can have a sort of bilateral, non-condescending, charitable relationship with.
I saw an interesting analysis recently, and rather than looking at Putin's regime and criticizing it from a liberal point of view, this commentator was actually looking at mortality rates. And they showed an extraordinary figures where Ukraine was quite slow, actually, to recover from a huge dip that was experienced in the post-Soviet period.
Yeah, in the 1990s, male life expectancy was down to sort of mid-50s, I think.
Went through the floor, didn't it? Which
it was extraordinary. Yeah.
And Russia seemed to recover relatively quickly all the way through to 2014. And I think that's a pivotal year, because the mortality rate, instead of creeping up and really following the Western curve, albeit at a lower level, really started to dip back down again in 2014. And I didn't see the detailed data, but I'm sure the mortality rate from Putin's foreign adventures will have an impact. And the channeling of economic funds and resources away from the economy.
Well, we're back to the Soviet Union, aren't we? You know, upper Volta with rockets, as it used to be called.
That's it. And
it is strange, isn't it? Sorry, go on. Yeah.
My last question really is going to be really turning it back to Ukrainians. I mean, what is your impression of why they're proving to be so sort of resilient? What aspects of their culture and character do you think really distinguish them from Russians, and maybe help to explain a future?
First of all, they're fighting for their homeland, and all the people I know are some of them are half Russian, so it's a usual mix, but they're deeply, well, hatred is the word. Most of the people I know, they do not like the Russians and never did, for a long time. Secondly, they are used to extreme hardship historically and even in recent years. So they would put up with things which us sort of soft Western are very difficult indeed. My friend sent me a picture showing, he said, with 3 Christmas candles, you can heat up enough water to have a cup of tea. So he sent me a picture of 3. He said, "Happy Christmas." And they have a good sense of humor. They're also historically underdogs. They were underdogs to the Poles, underdogs to the Habsburgs, underdogs to the Russians, and they have, they're very strong and very fierce, and they're defending their own homeland. And of course, as I said earlier, Putin's invasion has enormously strengthened their sense of national identity and their ability to help each other, which impressed me 20 years ago, and their ability to improvise is all to the fore. It's also interesting when you read articles about the way the NATO and other Western countries were retraining the Ukrainian army from 2014 onwards. Apparently, in 2014, the Ukrainian army was pretty hopeless in the Soviet style. And the whole thing is about training up an NCO level, delegating authority. Apparently the Russians started this in the early 2000s, trying to create an NCO stratum in the army, and so gave up, and they just reverted to top down. And they're inflexible, and it's quite clear that's a hopeless way of trying to fight a war. And I'd like to think that this delegation and retraining would be nice if somehow that could be spread out to Ukrainian society as a whole and get away from the top-down, highly inefficient and corrupt hierarchy of the past.
And of course, that top-down hierarchy isn't just created because it's easy and lazy. It's also the ideal structure to skim money off
exactly,
at each
exactly.
level.
I mean, it's all about kleptocracy. Exactly.
Yes.
And well, they may come under Oliver Bullough and the City of London and everything else. So, this country has been benefiting from what is theft from many countries of people in power. And then, of course, it all comes down to the business of the rule of law and independent judiciary, because democracy is meaningless without an independent judiciary. You can introduce elections. What do they mean? And I mean, Ukraine is a long way to go there. As far as I can make out, justice is still essentially a question of, who's got the biggest political clout or pays the judge the biggest bribe. And to establish that is you can't do that quickly.
And my last question really relates back to something you just said there. So this, the ability of Ukrainians to take Western training, the NATO training since 2014, yes, absorb it and then apply it yes, very successfully. Did you see that same tendency in the medical establishment when you were teaching?
With the people I worked with, on the whole, yes. And that's because they're not proud in the way the Russians are. Most of the people I worked with were happy to accept I probably, had better equipment than they had and knew a bit more than they had. And they were happy to take advantage of that. I made various mistakes, but as I said, I found them a lot easier to work with on the whole than the people I worked with for a while, both in St. Petersburg and Moscow 20, 30 years ago.
There's something about this sort of imperial swagger, which even some of the liberal opposition, you can feel almost like an unconscious sense of superiority.
Well, it's at the end of Gogol's Dead Souls, isn't it? Where he was Ukrainian, of course, where he compares Russia to a troika going off into the distance, and it's full of mysticism and Slavic soul. That really goes back to Peter the Great, doesn't it? And this sort of terrible schism between Russian pride and knowing that actually things are a bit better in the West often.
And a state that is out to get you. And
exactly.
We can only hope that Ukraine comes to terms with that, and their government, which seems to, serves the people rather than its own interests.
Yeah, I agree. But how things have changed. All my friends were actually contemptuous of Zelensky when he was elected. They felt humiliated having a TV comedian as president. But, he's done very well. He's obviously got brilliant PR marketing advisors. But the real challenges will come with Reconstruction and whether he will have taken on board a better way of doing things. That I don't know. I don't think anybody can tell yet.
Yeah, and they may find the Churchillian dilemma, a great war leader, and not necessarily a great peace leader.
Exactly. It's easier to lead a war like the one they've found, particularly when the West is queuing up to give you so much help. Although, not all the help they need, and always a bit too late. They should have given Patriot anti-air defense systems quite a long time ago. I was talking to somebody when you and I were with Edward, suggesting there was a sort of deal between America and China, but China won't give anything to Russia, and America won't give, fifth generation jets and Patriot missiles and ACTMs and things like that. So that there may be some truth in that.
Yeah, there could be to stop the conflict going nuclear, some kind of backroom deal,
getting out of control. Imagine having to go to North Korea for ammunition. I mean, really talking about.
And winter coats. I mean, that's not going to work out too well.
No, that's extraordinary.
Well, Henry, I know it's getting on, and it's been a massive privilege hearing
No,
from you.
it's my pleasure. That's fine. I wish I knew more about what was going on medically at the front line, but I don't. My friend David Knott does. He's been out there doing training courses, which is fantastic in battlefield surgery. I'm just a concerned, not exactly an outsider. In fact, I don't speak Ukrainian. I did a talk last week for the Ukrainian Institute, and they've offered me cut price Ukrainian language lessons. And I thought maybe at long last I should, by now that I'm retired and I have more time, even though my wife won't let me go back to Ukraine at the moment. She's convinced I'll get blown up, which is very annoying because I'm sure I wouldn't be blown up. No, it doesn't bother me. But yeah, no, I realize that I'm unusual in having been going there for 30 years and having had this very long connection with the country, even though I don't speak the language.
And must have a real stake in the victory as well, I'm sure.
Oh gosh, yes.
You'll be...
I mean, but we all do. And the thought of Putin even remotely victorious, that's like giving a green light to evil and dictators and kleptocrats all over the world. So it is not a battle the world can afford to lose, particularly with climate change coming already here, which needs a lot of international cooperation.
Absolutely. And my relatives who fled Central Europe in the 1930s, it also feels very important.
Which part?
Vienna. Well, they originally...
Oh, right. From after the Anschluss. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yeah, but originally from sort of Poland and not native.
Well, my mother wasn't Jewish, but she had to leave. The Gestapo were after her, so she had to leave in a hurry in '39.
Similar. It makes it very poignant, doesn't it? And really makes you root for Ukraine.
Yes. It also makes Brexit incredibly painful.
Well, that'll cause a few comments there. I have a mixed audience, but no, that's fine. Henry, it's been a huge pleasure.
That was fun.
Thank you so much for your time.
Good luck.